welcome to our next AMA with Dennis Kelleher from Better Markets. So we've got Platinum Sparkles with us as well. So it's a pleasure to have you aboard, Dennis. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Great. It'd be great to hear a bit about yourself and Better Markets for those people that aren't actually familiar with yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. So Better Markets is a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. We promote the public interest in the financial markets. We are funded entirely by public donations. We don't get money from the government. We don't get money from the industry. We're completely independent, and we take positions that we think are in the best interest of the public, be it retail investors on the security side or taxpayers on the too big to fail bank regulation side. I co-founded Better Markets with a visionary philanthropist named Mike Masters back in 2010, which was a couple of years after the 2008 financial crash, which most people remember was pretty devastating for literally tens of millions of Americans, largely due to the biggest financial firms in this country for the 10 years prior to that crash, letting their greed get out of control, which caused them to engage not just in predatory conduct, but also illegal conduct. Ultimately, that crash caused a law to be passed, a pretty comprehensive law called the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act in 2010. That was signed by President Obama in July of 2010, and Mike and I formed Better Markets in October of 2010 to be a counterweight to the financial industry, mostly the biggest firms on Wall Street, throughout the policymaking process in Washington, D.C. They had spent 2 years and $1 gazillion trying to prevent that law from being passed. And they were now going to spend equal amounts of money and redeploy their army of lawyers and lobbyists to try and kill the law and the regulatory process. And so Mike and I formed the Better Markets to be a counterweight and to fight Wall Street throughout the regulatory process so that the financial reform law could actually get implemented and could rein in their most predatory behavior and, importantly, their behavior that actually threatens the systemic stability of the United States and the financial system and undermine our economy. You know, the financial system is supposed to be a wealth creation system, and it's really been hijacked by finance into becoming a wealth extraction system. And we created Better Markets to oppose that. And we have a staff of about 15 of experts and professionals in banking, commodities, derivatives, securities, and other specializations, including Washington politics and the media. And we engage in all those arenas on behalf of the public interest, opposing the biggest, most powerful financial institutions in the United States. As for me, I spent, I joined the Air Force in high school. I was a firefighter in the Air Force. Once I got out of serving, enlisted in the Air Force for about 4 years. I went to college and then law school. After law school, I joined a big Wall Street law firm called Skadden Arps, Slate, Maher and Flom. I spent almost 20 years there. I was promoted to partner twice and actually resigned twice to go into public service. And I served in the United States Senate in 3 very senior positions, including 5 years. The last 5 years I was there through 2010, and a senior leadership position in the United States Senate. And those positions equipped me well with an expertise and experience to actually found Better Markets and put ourselves in a position where we could effectively be a counterweight to Wall Street and the financial predators who were trying to kill the law. And we're still trying to basically game the system, rig the markets, rip people off, enrich themselves, largely at the expense of others. And so we've spent the last 11 years fighting against that lobby army, which inhabits Washington, D.C. kind of day in and day out. So that's me, and that's Better Markets.
That's actually really fascinating. I had no idea about the inception of Better Markets in regards to how you came about. So that's awesome. Well, let's kick off with the questions.
Sure.
So let's start with our subreddit's main topic in terms of what brought this community together. And I'm thinking, people would love to get your idea and your thoughts on the actions that brokers took disabling the buy button during the GME run-up last January.
I'm sure. Happy to share my thoughts. I do want to say first, one of the most important things to understand is how little we still know about what happened then. Now, we know what Robinhood did that day. It stopped its customers from buying certain stocks. And we know what the impact of that was. It eliminated one side of the market, which created the stock price. And of course, it favored the shorts, who were then enabled to cover at reduced prices and thereby saving them tons of money and maybe even saving them from going bankrupt. Unfortunately, that was done at the expense of the prior buyers of the stock, many of whom appear to have lost quite a substantial amount of money. We also know that DTCC, a clearinghouse, requires brokers like Robinhood to have sufficient capital to clear their trades. And we know, based on what's been said, that they made a gigantic margin call on Robinhood. And we know what Robinhood has said about that call, about the margin call, about the imbalance in trades. In fact, we know what they said several different times, where they said several different things. And we know what Citadel's CEO, Ken Griffin, said about it, including in particular that he didn't tell Robinhood to do it. And all of those things appear to be a lot of information. But the truth is, it's almost none of the important, really important information. So what don't we know? And I don't mean to evade the question. I'll get to the question and give you my thoughts on what happened. But I think it's important, really important, that even today, and deep into 2022, what we don't know. We don't know what were Robinhood's systems and controls for ensuring that there wasn't an order imbalance and that they had sufficient capital and margin. They're required as broker-dealers to have those systems in place so that these types of things don't happen. And what were the systems and controls at DTCC? Where were the early warning systems? Did they have them? Did they work? And when did DTCC first have concerns? Because my guess, I don't know, but it came before 3 a.m. in the morning, which is when Robinhood's CEO said he got a phone call saying from DTCC, he wakes up, he gets the phone call and says, we need whatever it is, $3 billion in the next 2 hours. My guess is, it's not like DTCC knew that at 2:59 and then made the call. So what were the events leading up to the conclusion at DTCC? And what did Robinhood know leading up to that? And why didn't they know? Because they're supposed to know. They're supposed to have systems and controls. And by the way, when did Robinhood first have concerns? They're supposed to be monitoring their book, the order flow, where their capital and margin is, and all those other things on a real-time basis. And equally important, what did Citadel know and when did they know it? It's not a question of whether or not Ken Griffin called up the CEO of Robinhood and said, stop letting people buy a GameStop or anything else. That's not how this system works. It's also not how collusion is done among sophisticated parties. Now, I'm not saying there was collusion here. I'm just saying that if there was collusion here, that's not how it's done. And so the questions really are, when did Citadel first know or see that there was an order imbalance building in the order flow? Keep in mind that Citadel sits at the juncture of multiple different markets. They're active in the dark, non-transparent, unlit markets, high-frequency trading markets, from dark pools to ATSs, known as alternative trading systems, and what people frequently refer to as internalization. They're also active in the lit markets. And there are now 15 so-called public exchanges out there, and there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 plus dark pools, ATSs, internalizers. Citadel has a pretty good view into most of those markets, and therefore they have a unique knowledge base of order flow, and not just from Robinhood, but from many different places. So when did Citadel see that there was an order imbalance building, and what did it do? And given its unique position in the market and its unique knowledge of the trade flows and the direction of the flows, I would guess, I don't know, but I would guess they had a lot more information about where things were heading before that 3 a.m. phone call. And so what were all the communications between Citadel and Robinhood in the days and hours leading up to the margin call? Again, not asking, did Citadel say, put a stop on the buy button? That's not the relevant question. Let's get the facts and the information. We still don't know all that. And what were the communications between Citadel Securities, which is clearing, which bought the order flow from Robinhood and executed those trades, the Citadel Securities separate from the Citadel Hedge Fund. But what were the communications between Citadel Securities and the Citadel Hedge Fund throughout this time? Because it's unlikely that the Citadel Hedge Fund and Point 72, the other hedge fund, which bailed out Melvin Capital to the tune of $2.75 billion, unless they were pretty confident that not only were they going to get that money back, but they were going to get a pretty good return on it. Because when you rescue somebody who's in distress, you normally extract onerous terms. And they had to have a pretty substantial basis. Even Ken Griffin, who's phenomenally wealthy, I don't know what he is. He's way up on the Forbes richest list. Even he doesn't send out $2 billion to Melvin Capital without knowing on a factual basis to have a reasonable belief of a very significant return. Well, what were those facts? And what were the communications between Citadel Securities, the Citadel Hedge Fund, Melvin Capital, and Point 72, Steve Cohen? What were all those communications? That is a bunch, just the tip of the iceberg of the key information that we don't know as to what happened, the events around Robinhood shutting off the buy button. I could go on, but the point is there's a ton we don't know that we need to know. We should know. DOJ, the Department of Justice, and the SEC should be investigating this very aggressively for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is laws very well could have been broken here. Not because, Ken called Vlad and said, shut off the buy button. They're never going to do that. What you need to do is get the complete picture of all the facts and let independent investigators and analysts look at the facts and draw their own conclusions rather than relying on the self-serving statements of people who have a very, very strong interest in trying to shut down those investigations. So it's important to remember that. And keep in mind, there's smoke here and there may be fire, but we don't know. And that's, to me, one of the biggest problems. So therefore, I have more questions than answers, but you asked for my thoughts on what happened. Well, first of all, in my view, it never should have happened. Robinhood should have had better systems and controls to ensure that the order imbalance didn't happen, and systems and controls to make sure they had the cash on hand, either on hand or through lines of credit or otherwise, to meet margin calls, to handle their customers' order flow. And because this is so damaging to retail investors, that's why, even let's say no laws were broken. Even if no laws were broken, the SEC should have a thoroughgoing understanding of what happened here to make sure that this doesn't happen again, either to Robinhood or any other brokers, because clearly there was a massive breakdown here for this to happen. It shouldn't have happened. The law and the regulations, in theory, are in place to make sure it doesn't happen. The fact that it did happen means something went wrong somewhere. Maybe it was illegal conduct. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was negligence. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the rules and laws need to be changed. We don't know, and we should know. And so that's why, at a minimum, it's imperative that we find out the facts. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's what's happening. And it's really unfortunate that the media trumpets the statements of self-interested actors like the CEO of Robinhood, who said that this was a 2 Sigma event, a 3 Sigma event. I think he went so high as to say a 5 Sigma event, which actually reveals that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But even apart from that, he was trying to illustrate that this was so inconceivable, so unlikely, a black swan event that nobody could have been prepared for it. But all that is him saying, I'm not to blame. Don't investigate me. This is so rare. There's nothing to look at here. Well, when somebody does that, that's definitely when investigators and prosecutors should be looking. And what I say is, let's get the facts. The public are owed the facts, and they should be investigating and getting the facts. So those are broadly speaking, my thoughts about shutting off the buy button.
Yeah, it's funny. Like honestly, over the past year, I think that's probably one of the best takes I've heard on it. Is there's more questions that need to be answered than anything else. And looking at retail traders, there's been a whole host of us coming into the market over the past year and a half, and has this type of event ever happened before? Like, is this uniquely like happening right now? That being the first time ever that it's happened, or has there been similar instances in different, kind of covers?
Well, I'm not, sometimes I wish I was an academic who sat around and like studied the history of all these things, and then I'd be so much smarter than I am. So I'm not an expert, but it is not actually uncommon. I should say it's not common, but it's not unheard of that there are similar trading halts because broker dealers have to meet margin calls for one reason or another. But to my knowledge, nothing like this has ever happened anywhere near the scale with the impact that happened here. Um, so that it's kind of so I could say it's yes, it's happened before, but that's a little misleading. This hasn't happened before, and nothing on the magnitude and impact of this by a broker dealer just saying to all its customers, we're going to eliminate the entire side of a market, the entire buy side of this market. While we know there's a massive short position out there that has to get covered, and we're going to eliminate that at this particular point in time with all of Robinhood's customers sitting there hitting the buy button. That, to my knowledge, has never happened in any way, shape, or form before. But it does happen from time to time at a much, much, much smaller scale. Not frequently, but it does happen.
Do you foresee this happening again?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm very worried about it happening again because there's just been because I have all those questions I just talked about. If I thought that the SEC and or the Department of Justice were doing a pretty thorough investigation, and that they were either going to determine that laws were broken and they were going to then try and punish the people, but in my view, even if the laws weren't broken, the SEC owes it to the public to do a very thorough investigation and disclose to the public why it happened and why the SEC has concluded that if they do, that the system worked and this was a particular aberration for the following reasons. Because if they don't do that, I say to myself, well, we still don't know why this really happened. We don't know actually, and most of the basic facts we don't know. The public doesn't know. And therefore, how can anybody have any confidence that this is not going to happen again, either by Robinhood or some other broker dealer? Now, people can say, well, what are the odds of all these retail investors going in and trying to execute a short squeeze? What are the odds of a Wall Street bets kind of subreddit crowd deciding to do something or not do something? And they could give themselves false comfort by saying, well, that won't happen again. But to me, it's like, we already know their ability to predict the future is pretty poor. And so I'm pretty humble about predicting the future. And when you see something like this happen, the first thing you should think isn't that it can't happen again. It should be, A, we need to understand it thoroughly, and B, make sure it doesn't happen again. And that means making sure we understood what just happened. And so the fact they haven't done that causes me to be concerned. I do worry about it happening again.
What do you think might have played out if the buy button was not disabled?
It's funny. I've been asked that before, and it gets back to what I just said. That if I could see the future or a counterfactual like that, go back in time with any clarity, I'd probably be trading in the market and making a lot of money, right? So we don't know. It's interesting. I thought about it because maybe the buy side would have kept buying and pushing the stock up. Maybe it would have punished the shorts. Maybe the short squeeze, the gamma squeeze would have been even greater. There would have been more short sellers, hedge funds blowing up, going bankrupt, needing bailouts. But it's also possible that the buying would have trailed off, because as the price got higher and higher and higher, there were more and more people on the buy side saying, it's time to take some of these profits. Now, it's true. A lot of people were saying, we're diamond hands, we're in it to finish it, we're never selling. There was a whole cohort there, but there's also a cohort of people who were buying and going to, likely going to sell. Now, what was the balance on the buy side of those who had diamond hands and those who were going to take some of the money off the table, or those who were predicting a peak, maybe, irrespective of what Robinhood did in terms of prohibiting buy orders? So it's really difficult to tell whether or not the scenario that a lot of people seem to assume would have happened was going to happen. It's just hard to know. They might very well be right, and we'll never know, because Robinhood took this shocking step of shutting down one side of the market, advantaging the other side of the market, and really inflicting very significant losses on a very significant amount of its customers.
Just to expand on that, because it wasn't just Robinhood. It was, I think we saw other brokers shut off the buy button as well. So is this more prevalent in terms of like a more systemic problem that occurred as an indication of that it wasn't just Robinhood, that it was other brokers that are established?
Well, given the retail order flow into these stocks through Robinhood, and onto Citadel, largely, you're right. Robinhood wasn't the only one, but Robinhood was disproportionately impactful because of the order flow through Robinhood. But you raise an important point, which is this isn't just about retail investors being, the best you can say is, mistreated. And that's probably way too kind. But it's not just about how retail investors are treated. There are significant systemic issues involved. And one, for example, is the interconnectedness of the financial system. If Robinhood couldn't make its margin call, what happens then? What is the scenario where Robinhood declares bankruptcy rather than stopping the buy button, ends up in bankruptcy that day, the next day, a few days later? What happens if multiple hedge funds? What if Melvin Capital wasn't bailed out? And if Melvin Capital wasn't bailed out, then that means not only its investors were going to lose money, but Melvin Capital has innumerable counterparties. Many of those counterparties are what are called prime brokers at the too big to fail banks. The Wall Street banks like JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Now, I don't know which banks were Morgan Stanley's prime brokers, but one can assume the prime brokers at one of the 5 biggest firms in the United States were probably his prime brokers. He's also the Melvin Capital is interconnected with other hedge funds. And if the price continued to go up and more shorts had to cover, then it's likely that other shorts and hedge funds were going to go bankrupt too. So it's not difficult to envision a relatively realistic scenario where multiple bankruptcies cascade into multiple bankruptcies. And the question then becomes, and so, for example, even think about what's the impact on Citadel Securities and DTCC, and it just kind of goes on and on from there. So you're right, and I'm not saying that would have happened. I don't know. We don't know the interconnectedness. One of the problems is that most of these firms are either in or connected to what's called the shadow banking system, which is a bunch of financial firms that do a lot of bank-like things, but are barely regulated and are not transparent. So we don't actually have a very good window into the interconnectedness, nor what the consequences of failure within that interconnected system would be. But it's not difficult to see it getting very systemic very quickly, and therefore threatening the financial system and risking taxpayer bailouts again. And that's just one other reason why regulators and prosecutors should be taking this much, much more seriously than accepting the self-serving statements of the Robinhood CEO about his inability to figure out what a Sigma event is, and others who say, nothing to see here, don't look here, everything's fine, we got it under control. There are a lot of reasons to be worried about both what happened and what it means about what might happen in the future.
So we saw from the GameStop report published by the SEC that they put forward 4 specific areas to reflect on: shortening the settlement cycle, gamification and payment for order flow, trading in dark pools and through wholesalers, short selling, and market dynamics. What's your perspective and opinion on these 4 highlighted areas in relation to the events in January?
Sure. First, I hate to do this again, but I'd first like to comment on the report itself, if I can. It's important for people to understand that that was not actually an SEC report. It was an SEC staff report. And there's a world of difference between a report that's conducted under the direction with the input of the SEC Commission, the chairman and the commissioners of the SEC, and an investigation and a report that's done by the staff. I mean, no disrespect to the staff at all at the SEC or elsewhere when staff reports are done, but the thoroughness, the rigorousness, and the vetting process for a staff report is significantly different than a report done by an actual agency. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. And in this case, I'm not in any way questioning the intelligence, the capability, and the good faith of the staff at the SEC. I know many of them well. I've known many of them for many years. I have an incredible amount of respect for a lot of very, very diligent, hardworking public servants over there. But this report, in my opinion, was done too quickly and was not thorough enough. Now, that's what happens when there's public pressure for an agency to investigate or something and then let the public know what happens. There's always tension between getting something done fast and getting something done thorough. And I'm not sure the balance was struck here. As I said earlier, there is still a massive amount of questions here just about the shutting off of the buy button. And that's not dissimilar to many questions about many other aspects of what happened here. There's also been some very serious questions raised about the conclusions of the staff report. A number of academics got together and decided to basically independently look at the facts around the same circumstances that the SEC report looked at. And they actually expanded the data set. So the SEC used a fairly limited data set to determine the role of the shorts and the role of the short squeeze, and importantly, the role of the gamma squeeze. And these academics who got additional data, trade data, at a pretty granular level, which, and let's face it, if the academics could get it, the SEC could have got it also. And the academics raised some very, very serious data-based, rigorous data-based questions about the conclusions of the SEC staff report as to the causes and the actions relating to the trading leading up to and surrounding the shut off of the buy button, as people refer to it. So I think it's important for everybody to understand that it was a staff report. And that staff report, there have been very serious questions raised about the conclusions in that staff report. Again, not because of the good faith, hard work of the SEC staff, but because of the window within which the staff worked and looked at. Now, regarding the 4 topics that you mentioned in the report, shortening the settlement cycle. Sure, let's shorten the settlement cycle. We should have been shortened it to T+1 some time ago. There's a pending rule now. Proposal now to do that. My guess is that once it goes through the rulemaking process, that will happen, and that will be good because the reducing that time reduces the time to settle a trade. Therefore, it reduces the amount of margin. It reduces the amount of risk to the customer, to the broker, and to the clearinghouse like DTCC. That's all good. We do have some concerns at Better Markets about the wisdom of going to T+0. There are some real benefits to settling within the day because it allows financial institutions to net buy and sell orders. And there's some serious concerns raised by people who are very much smarter than I am about the costs, inefficiencies, and complications of doing real-time settlement in connection with stock trades, rather than, for example, end of day or sometime after the end of the day. So I think we're going to see it go from T+2 to T+1. There'll be a big discussion about how much shorter it can go. It can probably go to T plus end of the day. I don't going to T+0. I think is going to meet some resistance, and that's going to be an ongoing discussion over the next year or so. So it's a good thing to do. They're going to do it, and we support that. On gamification, look, the truth is gamification is almost always exploitation and manipulation. It is not democratization. The point of most gamification is to get people to do things thoughtlessly. And in this case, in particular, getting them to trade and trade often with as little thought as possible. In fact, the whole point of gamification is basically to short circuit or jump over the thought-making process. And while that's fine if you're playing a video game without consequence, that's not what people should be doing when they're actually investing their hard-earned money. And we all know many of these retail traders do not have a lot of money, do not have a lot of savings, and therefore we should be careful about how they are being tricked into making investment decisions. But that's what gamification too often is all about. And in fact, we've drafted, myself and a couple of my colleagues have drafted a very extensive law review article on just this that's going to come out this summer in the Western New England Law Review. It's about democratizing equity markets and in a way that is not predatory and is not manipulative. And it can be done, and it should be done. The market should be democratized. Barriers to entry should be lower. Costs should be lower. Access should be easier. And frankly, there's no reason it can't be fun. But it doesn't have to be predatory. It doesn't have to be gamified in a predatory way. And that's a very big problem. We've spent a fair amount of time talking to the SEC and other regulators about this. We have pretty strong views on this. We, in fact, just last week, we were speaking with the chairman of the SEC and his senior staff about these and related issues. So gamification, I think, is going to be a big issue going forward. I think you're going to see some significant regulatory action there. And our views will be spelled out, unfortunately, probably more than most people want. I think the law review article is something like 80 pages long, but it really takes people through the whole concept of gamification and the so-called democratization of our equity markets. The third topic was dark pools and wholesalers. Somebody, a wag said, look, it's called dark pools. Do you need to know more? Dark pools and wholesalers probably have a role to play, a legitimate role to play in our equity market structure. But the problem now is that we have basically two completely separate parallel markets. We have an unregulated, non-transparent dark markets that has, as I said earlier, something like 40 different venues between dark pools, internalizers, high-frequency trading wholesalers, alternative trading systems, however you want to label them. And then we've got lit markets, which are about 15 regulated exchanges. And there's interconnections between all of that, the dark pools, the wholesalers. You have Citadel sitting in the middle of virtually all of that. They're not only active in the dark as a wholesaler, internalizing with the dark pools, the alternative trading systems, and their market makers on the exchanges. And so you have a multiplicity of problems that largely arise from the fragmentation of our equity markets. And it's telling, I think, that I don't know what the current number is, but something like 90% of all retail trades are executed in the dark markets. Well, isn't it interesting that 90% of the institutional buy-side trades are not done in dark markets? Gee, I wonder if they think regulated, transparent public markets get them better prices because they have both professional staffs, they have a big interest because they're usually trading in size, they have fiduciary duties to their customers to get the best uh, prices, etc. So I think there is, well, in theory, for example, for substantial block trades and other things, there's in theory an argument why dark pools and wholesalers could perform a useful function. But in practice, unfortunately, the lack of transparency and regulation has too often led to people being ripped off, retail traders, most, I believe, but not just. And in fact, if you look back over the last 5-10 years, the number of enforcement actions against dark pools, wholesalers, and internalizers for breaking the law and ripping off their clients is quite substantial. And if you, which is just true, if you know that the number of enforcement actions are quite small relative to the legal violations, which is to say, there's lots and lots of legal violations, and you get very, very few legal actions just because of the nature of the imbalance between, regulators doing investigations and the activities of market participants. It's probably even more significant than you can see in the rap sheet for these guys. Justice Brandeis on the Supreme Court said many, many years ago, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that's as true today as it was then. And if disinfectant wasn't needed, those active getting rich in the dark pools, the dark markets, wouldn't be so afraid of the sunlight. Finally, your last point, I think, I don't remember precisely what the SEC staff report said about short selling. But as we all know, short selling can, if done right and properly regulated, perform an important function in the markets. The problem we have, of course, is that there's been very significant predatory short selling activities, both revealed in connection with the GameStop trading frenzy, the buy button shut off, et cetera. But even apart from that, it's not uncommon to be reading about predatory short selling activity, whether it's abusive short selling and basically a pump and dump schemes or otherwise. So there's a whole lot that has to be done in connection with short selling. And in particular, we need more disclosure of, more firms, more information, more timely, but we also need more examinations and more enforcement in that area. And to the extent people didn't think we needed it, it became crystal clear in connection with the GameStop trading frenzy that it's long overdue and there's way too much predatory behavior going on.
So the research paper that you were talking about, is that available for us to see?
It is. I wish I had the foresight to write down the name and site for it, but I didn't.
That's okay. If you could link it to us, we could post it with the AMA, and that would be awesome.
We'll do that. And in fact, we'll post it. I may have it posted on the website. Our website, www.bettermarkets.org, has a lot of information. I should have mentioned this earlier. If you go to the website and you go to there's a little question sign up there. If you search for example, short selling or Citadel or almost anything else that you care about in connection with this, you'll get all sorts of documents. We've got a Citadel fact sheet. We've got a short selling fact sheet. We've got a GameStop, overview. There's a whole lot there. In addition to that, we file comment letters. We just filed a comment letter in January on the SEC's proposal on securities lending, which obviously implicates short selling. There's a lot of materials there, but we will post this and I'll put in a bunch of keywords to make sure people can find it, and we'll send that to you also.
Awesome. Thank you.
It's really interesting because I think it's the first time that I've heard that report that the SEC released was a staff report rather than a proper proper, what do you put, investigation into the matters, taking their time. And it's funny, I feel like a bit of our community was very responsible for pushing to investigate those events that maybe led to that particular report. Do you get that feel?
I think I don't want to in any way suggest that the staff report isn't proper. It's just that the process for a staff report versus a commission report is different. Now, there are pluses and minuses. Some people will tell you, well, if you got an SEC report, it would take a lot longer and it would go up to the commission, and then there'd be a big partisan fight between the Republicans and the Democrats, and it would get watered down. So I'm not trying to suggest that anything untoward or improper was done here. What was done was entirely proper. It's just that there is a difference between a staff report and a commission report. And in my opinion and experience, when you get a commission report at the SEC or anywhere else, and the principals are involved, it tends to be much more thorough and much more rigorous. And that's not a knock on the staff. It's just different things being done differently.
Thanks for clarifying that. So to move on to a separate topic altogether, which is direct registration system. Retail investors have only learned of this system very recently, and it's great to have the feeling of ownership over one person's shares. And the most surprising aspect I felt like that we discovered was the aspect of the board of directors are not allowed to advertise the fact that shareholders can direct register shares. Do you know what the history behind that is? Because it sounds very counterintuitive in nature.
I've heard this also, and we've looked at this, and we have not found any indication that board of directors are not allowed to advertise that. We've seen some of the things that have been said on some of the forums and the subreddits and elsewhere. And yet, when you look back at what one particular academic referred to, it actually doesn't say that if you go back to the source. And so we have not found that to be the case. We could be wrong. We could have missed something. And if we have, happy to hear from people about that. So we haven't seen that, although it's interesting because typically boards of directors, where they're allowed to do it, well, if they're not allowed to do it, they wouldn't, but they're not typically giving advice or information to shareholders or companies about things like direct registration. That's left usually to the investors themselves with their financial advisors or their brokers or their own due diligence. In terms of direct registration, there's even a little bit of a debate about the wisdom of that, because some people have raised some concerns that there may be some difficulty in selling those shares, at least in terms of it being more time consuming than it otherwise would be. Now, of course, there's also obvious benefits to direct registration because you have it, your confidence level that you have the stock and it's not being lent out is materially different. But I think each investor has to think about the pros and cons for them in their particular financial situation as to whether or not direct registration makes sense. And it may not make sense all the time. It may make sense sometimes, but in the ordinary course, most stocks are not doing what GameStop or AMC or some of the other so-called meme stocks are doing. Once a stock gets a level of activity, attention, and volatility, then people may want to think about whether or not direct registration for those particular stocks makes sense or not for them, given their circumstances at the time.
On a similar vein of thought to that, I feel like direct registration has never been advertised in the fact. So, brokers, etc., don't really give that as an option, more as a public option. Regardless, it's very much kept under wraps. I feel like unless you know about the market in general and you're aware that it's
very hard to do.
Yeah.
Well, the brokers, of course, have absolutely no interest in telling their customers that, oh, by the way, you could cut me out and do a direct registration, right? So it's not only not in their interest, it's kind of against their interest. And there has been some discussion over time about whether or not brokers should be required to tell their customers that they have an option to do direct registration. But even there's a pretty big debate, because you already have brokers are required to provide all sorts of other information to their clients, leave aside whether they do it well, often enough, or right. And then the question becomes, how much information is too much information, and where are you going to put this in a hierarchy of information that a broker should give to its customers in the ordinary course? So, unfortunately, like many issues, there are arguments on both sides that, depending upon the investor, may make more or less sense for them.
Let's get into short selling. One of the main things identified
We'll now go to something really easy, like
yeah. One of the main things identified the past year is abusive short selling. How would you approach the regulation and/or reporting structure in order to prevent this?
Well, first, let me say, I don't think I need to say, but short selling can be a little complicated, and there are actually a number of moving parts. So, I would suggest that people do go to our website, www.bettermarkets.org, and search for short selling. And we've got a fact sheet up that spells out 10 recommendations that we have for reforming the regulation of short selling. And I won't go into all those details because it will bore most of the audience, but I will hit the highlights. But there is much more information on the website for people who want to dig in and understand the issues and our positions on them better. But overall, we recommend much more disclosure, much more often, and for more market participants. To me, and to us at Better Markets, that's about as basic as it gets, and it simply is inexplicable that there would be any meritorious argument against that. Now, there are arguments against disclosure. That's why I said we have difficulty finding meritorious arguments. There's plenty of them, but not many with merit. But we also need to close the loopholes. The so-called what's called the locate requirement under SEC rule SHO, rule show, allows broker dealers to claim that they have reasonable grounds to believe that they will be able to obtain the security and borrow it and deliver it by the delivery date. But that's just a massive loophole. I mean, anybody can have a reasonable belief at any given point in time. And sure, they're supposed to have a locate log, and there's supposed to be a rigorous process in place. But there's more than ample reason to believe that rigorous process is often not in place, and sometimes is at best misleading and incomplete, if not outright fraudulent. And so the locate requirement and the reasonable belief exception to the locate requirement that loophole should be recognized as a loophole and closed. There's also another loophole to the locate requirement for so-called hard to borrow securities. We have a hard time understanding that, because if there's a lot of intense interest in a particular security, then often it's going to be hard to locate. That doesn't mean that the law should have this massive loophole to enable significant short selling. And finally, there's the rehypothecation problem of the serially borrowed shares that get lent out over and over and over again. And so the market maker exception really needs to be reviewed, and in our view, closed. And another thing we think should be put in place, again, this is in the fact sheet, is the SEC should be considering position accountability and limits. And finally, we think they should reinstate the uptick rule, which was in place until 2008. And I think it was in place for roughly 70 years, seemed to work pretty good for 70 years. I understand the context within which it was reviewed and changed, but we now have 2008 to 2022 of experience without the uptick rule. And I think the arguments for the uptick rule at this point are quite persuasive. Now, I also want to add one thing that I don't think this is in the fact sheet, but it's kind of ever present, which is enforcement. Rules and laws mean nothing if they're not enforced. And anybody who watched the HBO Max documentary Gaming Wall Street, and I'm biased, they interviewed me and I'm in it a number of times, but in parts that I have nothing to do with, are very important, including a former banker at Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, and a bunch of other banks who says he naked short sold securities every day, every day. And he said the bank knew it and it was fine. Now, I would venture a guess that the bank was more than fine, that the bank incentivized it because there's a lot of money to be made here. And when there's a lot of money to be made, um, laws and rules and regulations are often twisted, if not broken, habitually, because there's a lot of money to be made. And in fact, this former banker even said in the documentary exactly that, something like, and I think this is almost a direct quote. I mean, when you're making a lot of money, you're interested in making a lot of money. And the point is, he's not interested in, worrying about every rule and law, especially when the bank he works for is at least okay with it, if not incentivizing it. And so, what we really need is some significant enforcement on naked short selling at the big firms, but also everywhere. But I'd start with the big fish. Unfortunately, the big fish usually are not targeted. There was reported that the SEC and the Department of Justice are actually doing a significant joint investigation of naked short selling that goes the time period going back to the beginning of 2021. I hope that reporting is accurate. I hope the investigation is, in fact, thorough, robust, and importantly, unbiased, which is to say that the politically connected, powerful, rich, big firms on Wall Street don't get a pass like they usually do. But let's hope that they're really going to do the investigation and that they will, frankly, finally put an end to pretty significant, what appears to be very significant, widespread naked short selling.
What are typically the time horizons in terms of investigating this stuff? Because it is a very complicated topic, and like, is this something we can expect within 2 years, 3 years, etc.?
So it's a great question, and there should be a perfectly reasonable answer, but there is not. Each investigation is unfortunately unique and depends upon the prioritization within the Department of Justice and the SEC, depends upon resources. It depends upon other things that happen out in the world that drain resources away from one thing to another thing. One of the things that we are at Better Markets are always advocating for is the importance for investigations, particularly on events that are widely reported, that the investigations happen as quickly as possible so that the public actually sees that prosecutors and regulators are doing their job as proximate to the event as possible. Now, sure, things take time. We get it. We want you to be thorough. You have to be thorough, particularly if you're contemplating, like the Department of Justice, charging somebody with a criminal violation, or the SEC charging somebody with a civil violation. If you're going to bring people up on charges of illegality, you've got to be careful, and you've got to make sure you've got all the facts, because if you make those allegations, you want to prove them and win your case. At the same time, you really need they need to move much quicker and bring these investigations to a resolution much quicker and disclose to the public the facts and circumstances so that there can actually be some public accountability. Now, there's some tension there because when people talk about public accountability, they're like, well, the bank should have public accountability and short sellers should have accountability. But the tension comes from if the Department of Justice or the SEC disclose their findings in connection with a legal proceeding or connection with a report, for example, that also enables public accountability of the SEC and the Department of Justice. And I'm not trying to suggest that everybody in those places doesn't welcome public scrutiny and accountability and oversight, but there's plenty of people who don't want that. And so there's a little bit of a tension between wanting and needing regulators and prosecutors to do thorough, robust investigations, pursue lawbreakers, or at a minimum, provide the public with adequate information to know what happened and why things happened, including why they didn't charge people. There's some tension between that and their desire not to be second guessed on the decisions that they make in those regards. So they usually take too long in our view. It should be shorter. It should be quicker. But they often take years.
Okay, that's good to understand. So thanks for the context. And on the topic of enforcement that you're touching on, we've got a few questions on the SEC, and I think your insight would be invaluable, as it's already proven in the past 50 minutes or so, given your experience in the industry. So to retail, the evidence in most cases seems black and white when it comes to the illegality of many topics. And when it comes to the SEC choosing cases to go after, have you noticed any particular themes in terms of what they tend to focus on, because it's easier to prosecute for or the likes?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and look, I was a defense lawyer at Skadden Arps for 18 years, I guess it was, or something like that. Cases often appear black and white. There are very few cases that are black and white. The public reporting of cases are often black and white, but they're also often very small slices of the facts and circumstances relating to reported or apparent wrongdoing or illegality. And once investigations start, whether you're a prosecutor, a regulator, or a defense lawyer, you find out that there are many, many more facts. Many of those facts are in conflict, and the conclusions one can draw from those facts are often multiple. And I mean reasonable conclusions. Now, the unreasonable conclusions are multiple too. But I think that there is, and I speak from, unfortunately, decades of experience here, that it's often not black and white. And often the cases are tough. And that's a problem too, because the tougher the case, the more reluctant a prosecutor or a regulator is willing to bring the case, because nobody's career has ever been advanced by losing a tough case. And one of the things we have been adamant about is that it's important for regulators and prosecutors to be aggressive and go after, either civilly or criminally, lawbreakers, even if they're not certain they're going to win. And unfortunately, too often, prosecutors and regulators want certainty of wins. And because they can't get that certainty, they end up settling for really sweetheart deals and slaps on the wrist that are, in our view, intended to fool the public into thinking they're doing their job, and to fool the public into thinking that these big financial institutions are actually being punished when they're not. And so I think the problem, one of the problems, is that we need prosecutors and regulators to be much more fearless in terms of, look, sometimes you're going to lose a case, and people should not be, their careers should not be hurt because they lost a case that they should have brought, but didn't have a guarantee of victory. That's the nature of litigation, whether it's civil or criminal. It just happens. Anybody who's got a record where they only won cases is somebody who has not ever dealt with a tough case. It's that simple. There's also the problem of very politically connected, powerful firms that it's very difficult for regulators and prosecutors to actually enforce the law against them. JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs are very good examples of that. JP Morgan Chase has now pled guilty to 4 or 5 very significant criminal charges over the last 10 or so years. But if you look at the so-called punishment for those crimes, they're quite they're nowhere near what they should be, and they're nowhere near what they would be if it wasn't JP Morgan Chase. And the same thing's true for Goldman Sachs. And indeed, literally right now, there's a major criminal case being brought by the Department of Justice against a Goldman Sachs partner in federal court in Brooklyn, in the Eastern District of New York, in connection with one of the biggest global financial crimes in history called 1MDB. Now, they're prosecuting a junior Goldman Sachs partner. Well, what about the 30 other executives and supervisors who were publicly reported to be involved in connection with this crime spree? And you see that time and time and time again, where prosecutors and regulators go after the minnows while the big fish swim free. And there's reasons for that. It's much more difficult to prosecute supervisors and executives, particularly criminally. And I think people spend too much time worrying about going after white collar crime with the criminal law. The criminal law has a very high bar to meet, importantly, because people lose their liberty, and they lose a lot more than that if you become convicted and you are a criminal. And therefore, our view is that it's the regulators and the civil actions against individual supervisors and executives at these financial firms, including the top tier firms, because they set the tone. If the industry knew that regulators and prosecutors would go after even the top tier firms, and that they were really genuinely fearless and even-handed and tough, then those prosecutions, be it civil side or criminal side, would actually have a deterrent effect. But we need to actually get the cops back on the Wall Street beat, doing their job. And too often, they're not doing it anywhere near the degree to which we think they should be. And unfortunately, the message that most of these cases send is that crime pays. I mean, they're actually such minimal penalties that they actually reward past law breaking, which incentivizes future law breaking. Now, we've been pretty aggressive on this since we were founded in 2010. We, in fact, even sued the Department of Justice for its sweetheart settlement with JP Morgan Chase a number of years ago. We were not successful, but we did highlight the many gross deficiencies in how the Department of Justice goes after financial firms. And I should say, we're an independent, nonpartisan organization. It was President Obama's Department of Justice we sued. It wasn't President Trump's. It was President Obama. And in fact, we also named the then Attorney General Eric Holder in addition to the Department of Justice. So we did not, I want to make it clear, we didn't win that case, but we've had this view for a long time that the SEC and Department of Justice and others really need to step up their game and start going after these people in a meaningful way.
I think it's a good message, particularly on while things seem like it's black and white, it's never always black and white. So I appreciate.
Believe me, I wish it was. It's tough. So I don't want, I think it's important because people have to have a realistic expectation. If the SEC sues some people, and if you read the papers, you think this is a slam dunk. The SEC should win. But the papers are reporting for a general audience. They're not talking about the evidence that's actually admissible against those people. And so you may then read an article that the SEC lost the case. That doesn't mean either that the SEC should not have brought the case. It doesn't mean that the SEC didn't do a very, very good job. The nature of litigation is that these are tough cases. And if you're going to be serious about enforcing the law, you're going to lose some of them. Let's face it, these defendants are not only sophisticated in how they conduct their business to make it very difficult to convict them, but they also have an unlimited war chest to hire the best defense lawyers to fight against underfunded, understaffed regulators. And so the deck in some ways is already stacked against the regulators and prosecutors. So they're going to lose some cases if they're doing their job, but it's important for the public to recognize that even if they lose the case, it's still a sign they're doing their job.
I think you may have just answered the next question, but I'll ask you anyways. Jon Stewart had a great interview with Gary on the topic of the SEC, and one thing stood out was their staffing levels and budget in general. Do you believe that the SEC is understaffed?
I don't think there's any question that the SEC and importantly the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and frankly the other regulators and prosecutors, they're all understaffed and they're all underpaid. Literally, you have public servants being paid. I mean, look, I don't want to suggest this isn't a lot of money, but they're being paid $150,000 a year, and they're going up against Wall Street law firms where those lawyers are being paid $5, $6, $7 million a year, and they're putting 5, 10, 15, 20 lawyers on the case, and the SEC or the CFTC have 1, 2, or 3 lawyers on the case. And there is just a huge imbalance between the regulators and prosecutors when they go up against the big firms and the big boys. And that's one of the reasons that they take into account. It's called litigation risk, the risk that you're going to lose the case. And it's ever present because of this imbalance. And the problem is that, look, it's a democracy. We're lucky to have a democracy, but that means that the budgets of these agencies are set by Congress. And Congress is lobbied nonstop by the Wall Street, the financial firms. The Wall Street and the financial firms are year in and year out one of the top lobbyists in Washington. And they literally lobby against the regulators getting budget increases. I mean, the CFTC, it's a crime, the budget that they have. They oversee derivatives markets with trillions and trillions of dollars being exchanged on a regular basis, and they have a budget of about $300 million. They have been starved for funds, in our opinion, because the regulated industry have used their political allies to make sure that they don't have the resources that they need to properly and fully regulate the industry they're supposed to regulate. The SEC is in a better position. It has a bigger budget, a better budget. It's not as severe at the SEC, but the SEC still does not have the funds, the staff, or the technology that it needs to protect the public interest and to do the job that they're actually required to do under the law, which is, number one, protect investors, have fair and efficient markets, facilitate capital formation. The job of the SEC is incredibly important, not just to our financial system, but to our economy and to everybody's standard of living and financial security, be it anybody who wants to, save for retirement or save for school or invest for the future. The SEC should get all the resources it needs, as should the Department of Justice and the other regulators, but they don't.
I think it's on a similar vein of topic. It's let's kind of address the revolving door between politicians and the financial industry. So moving away from the SEC. So some members of Congress are writing laws for former employees of the very financial firms they're writing laws to regulate, and in some instances they are on the payroll of those institutions for consultations, speaking fees, and things like that. So what can we do to actually shed a light on this and kind of, recognize this conflict of interest and kind of push it out to the masses and say, like, this is not good for the financial system?
Yeah, the revolving door is a really important issue for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's important because you have people basically selling out their public service, and that's bad. But what makes this even worse is that it is so corrosive to the public confidence and trust in government and government officials. It makes people think they're all on the take, they don't care about me, and it makes people very negative about government in general. And for those two reasons, it really must be addressed in a very serious way. We've been on this topic at Better Markets and myself for a very long time. But it's important to remember that the people who are actually hurt the most by the pernicious aspects of the revolving door are the thousands and thousands of hardworking public servants who labor in obscurity in, I will tell you, suboptimal conditions, which is to say, buildings that are old and ugly tough getting resources, being understaffed. It's important for people to realize that the people who they read about in the paper running through the revolving door, influence peddling, selling out their public service are a very small fraction of the thousands and thousands and thousands of public servants who are really doing a good job under often arduous circumstances. So with that as background, we need to do something serious about the revolving door. And we have proposed a number of things over the years. And really, it has three parts. Part one is when people are coming into the government, either from the industry or otherwise, they need to be very seriously vetted to ensure that when they're in public office, whatever that position is, that they will at all times put the public interest first, that they will not be working for de facto their prior employer or their future employer. Regrettably, I think we saw that repeatedly during the 4 years of the Trump administration, which filled the government with lobbyists for various industries, made them the regulators of those industries, and then they left and went back to the industry. And truthfully, if you looked at what they did before they were in government, when they were acting for a private enterprise, what they did when they were in government, when they were supposed to be acting in the public interest, and what they did afterwards when they went back into public private enterprise, there's very little difference of what they did there. That is a red flag for somebody who does not understand or doesn't care about the duties of a public servant. So number one, they have to be vetted very carefully and thoroughly before they get the job. They need to be monitored while they're in the job to make sure that they are acting in the public interest, that they don't have an eye either on their prior employer or on their next employer. And a big part of that, in our view, is that there has to be substantially more disclosure about what these people do when they're in office, who they're meeting with, what the subjects are, and what action that public official did or did not do in connection with that subject matter. That basic level of transparency would allow oversight and accountability that would be very healthy to the public interest. And then third and finally, there have to be very serious limitations and constraints on what people can do when they leave their public service to ensure that they're not selling out and influence peddling in a way that, may be legal technically, but nonetheless is corrosive to the public interest. Now, if I can, that is all sounds pretty negative. I do want to say something that's important that people often don't recognize, and that is the government needs the expertise of people in the private sector. You can't just say, well, we can't hire anybody from the private sector, and that way we'll have a pure government. We don't have to worry about that. Well, first of all, that doesn't tell you what people are going to do afterwards. So it only takes care of one part of the problem, and it actually creates a much bigger problem. The government cannot regulate the financial industry or the energy industry, for example, with people who don't know the ins and outs and the inside of the industry. Truthfully, I mean, one of the reasons we're so effective, and I believe Better Markets is effective, is because we have people with, vast multiple types of experience, public sector experience, private sector experience. We understand how Washington works, but we also understand how the private sector works. I was going to say we all, I don't know if it's all of us, but I think it's all of us who have a pretty significant experience in the private sector. That uniquely equips us to do our job. Similarly, it would be very difficult to regulate the financial industry by people who none of whom had experience in the financial industry. Similarly, in the old days, it used to be important for the private sector to have people who were in the public sector. They would often be the voice of reason, telling them how to comply with the law, how that they, what they're doing is wrong and how they should be doing it right. Unfortunately, nowadays, it's too often when people leave public service, what they're really doing is helping people evade the law, get around the law, or what's worst of all, in my view, are those who are in Washington helping to rewrite the laws, creating loopholes and advantaging particular private sector actors over the public interest. And so the revolving door, in short, is a pretty complicated issue, but it's very important. It can be addressed. It should be addressed, but it should be done in a way that enables the government to get the benefit of the expertise of the private sector. And we should do it in a way that the private sector can get the benefit, the right benefit from people who serve the government and the public interest by helping those companies and enterprises actually adhere to the law, follow the law, and be successful, law-abiding corporate citizens.
So our sub has been all about, better, smarter regulation, and to be honest, regulation in general the past year. So what are like the most realistic next steps that the super stock community can actually do to help facilitate better and fairer markets?
Well, it's a great question to ask about better markets, which is why we named our organization Better Markets, because who could be against better markets? I think it's important to recognize that there is enormous power in the community that's been created around investing in the markets. And they've demonstrated their power in the markets, as we've seen over the last year. But I do think it's important to recognize that to be really fundamentally effective in the markets, they also have to be engaged in the policymaking process. I think of it like it's like, opening day is happening soon and the baseball season is being kicked off now that the strike has been avoided. So I'll use a baseball metaphor. But, if a game begins and the first batter in the first inning gets up, and he steps up to the plate and he looks out at the scoreboard and he sees he's down, his team is losing 10-1 before the game even begins, he would say there's something wrong with the game. There's something wrong with the rules, and there would be. But that's effectively what happens when retail investors actually go into the markets. They are playing on a field that's already rigged and tilted by the biggest players who have already participated, if not actually written, the rules and regulations and laws that regulate those markets. And so there's two big, inextricably connected arenas. There's the market arena, but there's also the policymaking arena. If you're only active in one, you're going to limit your effectiveness. And one of the great things about these communities coming together about investing in stocks is they have realized that collectively there's an enormous latent power there that they can bring to bear. And they're so far in the market arena. The question is, can they do it in the policymaking arena, which sets the rules for the market arena that they're already active in? And they already know that some of those rules and regulations do not favor them at all, whether it's short sellers, whether it's hedge funds, whether it's wholesalers, whether it's retail brokers like Robinhood claiming to be your best friend when Robinhood appears to be the sheriff of Nottingham, as was so brilliantly illustrated towards the end of the Jon Stewart show. The whole point of Robinhood was to take from the rich and give to the poor, not take from the poor and give to the rich. And if anybody with unbiased eyes looks at what Robinhood has done here, they have become billionaires. I have not seen the headlines about all their customers who became billionaires. And so they have now seen that the way the rules are often don't work in their favor. So unfortunately, some of the things that happen is people get discouraged. They don't trust people. They opt out. They say, oh, a pox on everybody's house. Those people in Washington, they're all in bed together. All the lobbyists, they're all bought. They're all the same. A, it's not true. And B, it's the worst thing you can do. People who say that and do that basically abdicate the field and leave it to the lawyers and lobbyists of the biggest financial firms to continue writing the rules that are screwing the retail investor. So instead of being, bummed out and discouraged and disempowered, you ought to be engaging in the policymaking arena. And look, you have to be realistic. People simply can't think that I'm only going to engage with people who agree with me 100% of the time. And I'm only going to think good things happen if 100% of what I want, I get. That isn't how it works. And it also doesn't work like saying, you know what, I will comment on one rule and that will be enough. You have to basically, what we did at Better Markets, when I set up Better Markets, we looked at what the industry did and why they were so effective, and then we copied it. Okay, don't, it's not, yes, it's, they're doing, they're doing things in their own narrow self-interest to maximize their profits. Often the public interest be damned. So I'm not talking about that part, but in terms of being in Washington on a sustained basis and fighting in the trenches at the SEC, at the CFTC, at the Federal Reserve, in Congress, at the White House, in the administration, day in, day out, taking some wins, taking some losses, sometimes getting half a loaf, sometimes getting a slice, but going back the next day again and again and again. That's what's required. And that's what Better Markets does. Now, how does the community participate in that? There's a lot of different ways, but number one is the SEC exists to protect investors. It listens to investors. The problem is it doesn't often hear from investors. Now, that's because it's difficult to engage in the policymaking process and the rulemaking process. Nobody makes it easy. There's even a whole law called the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, which is supposed to facilitate public involvement, but ends up being more complex than it needs to be. Now, one of the things we've done at Better Markets is we've created a web page called Get Involved, and we've tried to simplify the process. And it doesn't have to be through us. People can do it on their own. They can go to the SEC website. Anybody can comment on a rule. But the comment needs to be effective. It needs to be substantive. It needs to have certain information on it so it gets to the right people at the SEC. And frankly, if the community banded together and they had a whole bunch of people willing to go to Washington, they could get an audience with people at the SEC and tell them what they want, why they want it. You go in and you say, hey, me and my 15 friends here are all investors. We trade regularly. This is what we do. This is what we see. And this is what we think is wrong. And you're proposing to do X. We don't think that's smart. Or, as important, we do think that's smart. And so just like Better Markets is a counterweight to the industry, this community could actually realize significant latent power by in addition to the Reddit rebellion kind of hitting the markets, that army marching on Washington and hitting the SEC in an effective way, not just in a, it can't be name calling and it can't be, lock them up, throw them in jail. All those guys are bad. That isn't effective in the policymaking process. What's effective is to look at what the SEC is proposing and make sure that it's consistent with your best interest as a retail investor. And if it isn't, making the SEC aware of why it isn't. And so that's the only way rigged markets are going to get a little less rigged, and the only way the predators are going to have less opportunities than they currently have. You can't get engaged in a game where the rules are already set by other people and their self-interest and expect the outcome to be different. What you have to do is start participating in writing those rules and writing those laws so that they're in your interest. And this community has already shown it has an ability to work together, to work smart, and to get things done. And what I'd say is, let's get that done in Washington.
Have you observed a difference in the quality or quantity of comments on SEC rule proposals over the past year?
That's a good question. It really isn't over the last year because it's a new administration and the rulemaking process just takes a lot of time. And so the rules ended up getting, the big rules are really just getting proposed now. So I'll have that's a question really to be answered maybe in 6 or 12 months once we start seeing the comment periods for many of these rulemakings that are coming. There's a comment period of 60, 90, 120 days. Comments will be filed and be publicly filed and then reviewed. I expect the quantity and quality of comments to be very different than during the Trump administration. largely because they were mostly deregulating. They were not. They basically took the industry's wish list and tried to put it into law. Unfortunately, basically across the administration. Now, there are obviously some exceptions to that, but not many. And so we're now engaged in an attempt to roll back some of that very dangerous deregulation. And, look at the industry's wish list is not going to have much overlap with the best interest of retail investors or the public interest for the most part, notwithstanding what their high-paid PR firms and CEOs love to say.
Okay, so let's end this on a question about you. You've clearly chosen the advocate side of the system, so we're curious. What inspired you to choose your career path?
Well, I mean, I've been very lucky. I've had several careers. I was a crash rescue firefighter in the Air Force and did all sorts of interesting things when I was younger. I was a lawyer at a big law firm, and I was lucky enough to be selected for 3 very senior positions, staff positions in the United States Senate. And when I was leaving the Senate, if you know anything about Washington, somebody like me who was a partner at Skadden Arps, specializing in financial markets and corporate conduct, and then having senior positions in the United States Senate, there really was the offers, the lobby offers were as you can imagine, pretty substantial. But at the end of the day, what I really thought was there's already way, way too many people working to make rich people richer. That's what they're spending their life doing, making rich people richer. Now, that's not what they say to themselves or say to others. And, they spend gazillions of dollars a year on PR firms and focus groups and picking their words carefully. But look, at the end of the day, that's what's happening. And I thought there were plenty of people doing that. And there really weren't enough people who were fighting for people, just regular Main Street people. I mean, I grew up in the inner city project in a single parent home on food stamps and free school lunches. And, to this day, I know what it means that at the end of the week, when the ends don't meet, they don't meet. And it's not fun. And you often think there's nobody on your side and you're never going to dig yourself out of that hole. And there's very little hope and very little opportunity. And the only thing you see when you look down the road is nothing very pleasant. And there's way too many people in the United States who are working their tails off, working hard, playing by the rules, trying to get ahead, and are constantly getting knocked back by too often rules and laws that are set by lawyers and lobbyists, flacking for their special interest, disregarding the public interest and disregarding literally hundreds of millions of Americans who are busting their butt just to get their fair shake and their part of the American dream. And so I thought, you know what, why not start an organization that's going to, take the other side, fight for the little guy, stand up for them, be a counterweight to the army of lawyers and lobbyists. I was lucky because, as I said, I partnered with a visionary philanthropist named Mike Masters, who is a unique individual in his generosity and his vision to see in 2010 that an organization like this was not only needed, but that he would fund it and that he would stand by it over the years and stand up to Wall Street, the most powerful industry in the country, if not the richest, and in many ways, the most ruthless. They don't appreciate opposition. They don't appreciate it when there's a counterweight to them in the media, in Congress, at the regulatory agencies. And so Mike, is a courageous, visionary person who partnered with me, created an organization, started it from scratch, because we wanted to stand up for the little guy, stand up for people on Main Street, stand up for the people in this country who are working hard, and they deserve their part of the American dream, rather than the people who already have more than they'll ever need and are constantly grabbing more and rigging the system to help them do it. Every time they do that, we're going to show up and we're going to take the other side. That's why I did it.
Awesome. Well, I think that was a fantastic session. I can't thank you enough for joining us the past hour and a half. So, really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate the opportunity, and truthfully, we appreciate the communities that have come together on the various subreddits to really push these issues to the forefront. And we hope that what we can do over time is engage them proactively and productively in the rulemaking process, as much as they've been proactive and productive in the market process, because they have enormous potential here. And we would love to see that enormous potential be realized.
Awesome.